The first words Simone Weston heard above the soft drone of the engines were, "I'm sorry, Ms. Weston, but we're out of your lobster bisque delivered by flight attendant Gloria Hensley," with a bright, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. And as Gloria lowered the cold chicken sandwich onto the gleaming tray table, the silence ringing in seat 1A felt heavier than the cabin pressure at 40,000 feet, because around Simone, three white men were being addressed by name: Mr. Langford, Mr. Sterling, Sister Peyton, their requested caviar and vintage champagne, arriving without hesitation, the men laughing lightly as Gloria bent low enough to brush their elbows, but barely glanced at Simone as if the seat she occupied was a mistake someone had forgotten to correct. And Simone felt a chill spread across her skin, despite the warm cabin air scented faintly of burnt coffee and lemon disinfectant, her pulse tightening at the realization this wasn't a supply issue or a missed order, but the familiar quiet refusal to acknowledge her presence as equal because she had ordered her meal 7 days ago with confirmation emails and reminders from the airline concierge. And yet here she was presented with a plastic tray of limp lettuce and stale bread, her Diamond Elite membership and 10 years of loyalty erased by a single condescending shrug. Simone's eyes flicked to the side as Gloria stepped, past her heels clicking softly on the thick carpet, stopping 2 rows back to offer hot towels scented with bergamot to Mr. Langford, her tone brightening to a pitch reserved for those who looked like they belonged. And in that moment, Simone's mind didn't flash with rage or wounded pride, but with the icy clarity of every boardroom where she'd been the only black woman every time an executive asked if she was the marketing assistant instead of the founder of the encryption company. They wanted to invest in every moment the world tried to convince her she had wandered into a room not built for her. And as the memory of those polite exclusions pulsed under her ribs, she reached for her phone, because she knew power didn't lie in raising her voice or standing up in the aisle. Power was built in the small, precise actions that made systems tremble from within, and with a slow swipe, she opened the secured line to her chief strategist, Malia Jordan, each fingertip movement deliberate as the laughter of the men in seats 1B, 1C, and 1D swirled around her like a low, mocking hum. The cabin lights shifted from soft white to pale blue as the flight crossed into Canadian airspace, the overhead announcement a low murmur about turbulence that never arrived. And as Simone studied the faint reflection of her face in the dark oval window, she wondered if Gloria realized how many times she'd done this, how many times she'd erased the meals or comfort of passengers like Simone, with a smile and a shrug, never expecting a single one to challenge the silent rules of first class, where respect was allocated by complexion and where service flowed to those who looked like they belonged in the plush leather seats. And when Simone caught Gloria's gaze for the briefest instant across the aisle, the attendant looked away quickly, her face folding into a mask of professional detachment that told Simone everything she needed to know. This wasn't an accident, this was a habit. Simone's fingers paused over the touchscreen as a soft chime sounded above seat 1A, the pilot's voice rising to announce the start of the main meal service, his words slipping through the cabin like warm syrup, even as the sting of rejection in Simone's chest felt cold and sharp, and she tapped the emergency protocol code 811 into the secure app, the green confirmation dot blinking once before disappearing as the signal raced through encrypted channels built into the Morgansex system, a network of hardened servers she herself had designed to protect whistleblowers and expose systemic bias in corporate infrastructure. And she thought if Gloria or anyone else in this polished cage of white linen and crystal glasses believed a cold sandwich was the worst they could do to her, they had no idea what she could do to them in return. A hush settled as Daniel Voss, the second flight attendant, approached the three men behind her, offering another round of champagne, his voice soft and deferential as he addressed each by name. Again, his back to Simone so completely, she wondered if he'd been instructed not to look at her, or if it came naturally to some people to pretend the only black woman in first class didn't exist. And as the faint clink of crystal flutes touched together over muted chuckles and casual talk of offshore markets drifted past her ears, Simone wondered how long the airline had gotten away with this, how many times someone like her had accepted the cold sandwich, the cold tone, the cold shoulder in silence because they thought speaking up would confirm the stereotypes others carried like invisible baggage. And with each slow exhale, she felt her pulse sink with the soft rumble of the engines, until every beat whispered this time will be different. She scanned the cabin slowly, eyes lingering on the carefully embroidered Stratosphere logo stitched into each headrest, cover the subtle scent of expensive leather, mingling with the faint whiff of reheated bread. The overhead lights sparkling like tiny stars reflecting off polished chrome trim, all of it designed to create an illusion of equality and prestige that crumbled the moment Gloria's voice dropped a single octave when speaking to her. And as Simone rested her right hand on the armrest, she wondered what stories the men behind her told themselves to stay comfortable, while someone was so obviously singled out beside them, whether they truly didn't notice or chose not to see, because it was easier to believe first class was fair when you never had to prove you belonged. The seatbelt sign pinged softly, a reminder of the illusion of order in the cabin, and Simone felt the smallest tremor of turbulence ripple under her feet, as if the plane itself was bracing for the shockwave she was about to set in motion. She imagined Gloria in a training session, repeating words like respect and service standards, while learning to look through people like Simone, and she couldn't help wondering if Gloria would remember this flight tomorrow, or if she'd file it away like every other time she had used a cold meal to remind a guest of their place, never suspecting the guest in seat 1A would carry every detail to the very top of Stratosphere Air's chain of command. A soft vibration pulsed against Simone's wrist as the secure line connected Malia's confirmation message, appearing in tight white letters over a black screen. Protocol initiated full audit engaged flight, 2444 crew profile, under review data sync in progress. And for the first time since the sandwich landed before her, Simone let her eyelids flutter, close just for a moment, the darkness behind them crackling with the memory of every boardroom. Slight, every elevator conversation cut short every time she was asked who she was there to meet, instead of being assumed the person others had come to see. And beneath the calm expression on her face, a quiet, unbreakable promise formed. I won't let this pass into silence like all the others. The soft whir of cabin fans vibrated through Simone's seat as she opened her eyes, the stale scent of reheated bread still clinging to the air, while Daniel Voss moved from row to row, his voice smooth as polished marble, when addressing Mr. Langford and Mr. Sterling, but taut and brittle when his eyes accidentally slipped over Simone before skittering away. And Simone noted each gesture with forensic precision, cataloging every glance, every forced smile, every moment that revealed how easily the performance of civility cracked when someone like her disrupted the quiet choreography of first class, because it wasn't the cold sandwich itself that stung, but the coordinated indifference, the certainty that their small, casual slights would go unanswered because polite society depended on the silence of people who had learned too well what happened when they made noise. She let her gaze drift across the cabin's darkened ceiling, where pinpoint reading lights cast miniature spotlights over rows of crystal flutes, the delicate hum of conversations floating through the stale, filtered air, like echoes of another world that didn't include her. And as the steward moved past offering warm towels, one last time before the main course began, Simone felt the dull ache of old memories surface, the junior partner who asked if she was lost outside a C-suite lounge, the hotel manager who double-checked her credentials before allowing her into a VIP reception, the bank clerk who spoke only to the white junior associate trailing behind her. Each moment a notch carved into her resolve, until this moment in seat 1A felt less like an insult and more like the final proof that the world she had worked to conquer still believed she didn't belong. Malia's second message appeared in a bright blue notification pulsing softly on her smartwatch. Partial crew profile retrieved 3 prior customer complaints naming Gloria Hensley involving delayed or denied service, 2 of which cited minority passengers in premium cabins. Simone inhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the armrest as the quiet churn of engines beneath her seat resonated with the low, cold anger growing in her chest. And she thought how odd it was that an entire industry dedicated to comfort could weaponize indifference so efficiently, because in the span of a few polite words and a single cold tray, they had managed to reduce her from a celebrated CEO to an inconvenience to be handled and forgotten. Simone's eyes slid back to Gloria, who hovered near the front galley with a clipboard held like a shield across her chest. Her lips curved into a faint smile as she chatted with Mr. Langford about his upcoming investments in European energy markets. Her voice low and familiar in a way it had never been with Simone. And as she gently touched the older man's shoulder with a practiced, fleeting caress, Simone wondered how many times that same hand had delivered warmth and comfort to those Gloria deemed worthy, while offering only sterile courtesy to everyone else, and whether Gloria even recognized the quiet violence of her selectivity, or if it was so ingrained it no longer registered as a choice. Outside the cabin windows, a pale sliver of moonlight split the clouds as the jet glided silently over the Atlantic. Each blink of the wingtip beacon, casting brief white flashes across Simone's reflection, highlighting the slight tremor in her fingers as the magnitude of what she was about to unleash settled in her bones. And with each measured breath, she felt the tension give way to an electric focus, the same focus that had carried her through 16-hour days in empty offices, the same focus that had kept her steady when investors asked if she had a male partner to handle the technical side of her encryption platform, the same focus that told her this wasn't just about her meal, but about the quiet rot she was about to expose. A ripple of turbulence shuddered through the cabin, the lights overhead flickering once as the plane adjusted course, and the small gasp from Gloria startled Simone with its sincerity, a sound that carried a human fragility Gloria had not shown once in their brief interaction. But as the seatbelt sign chimed again, and the captain's voice rose to reassure passengers, Gloria straightened her spine, snapping back to perfect posture. The mask sliding into place so smoothly, Simone wondered how many years it had taken to perfect it, and whether Gloria had ever questioned who she was willing to serve with genuine warmth, and who she would only tolerate with professional detachment. Simone's phone buzzed, softly in her hand, final report compiled. Malia's note began, including attached incident logs, confirmation of order call records with the airline concierge, and timestamps showing pre-order confirmation 7 days before departure. Simone's breath caught in her throat, a soft hiss slipping through her teeth as the completeness of the evidence settled like armor around her shoulders, because what had begun as a single tray of food now stood as proof of a pattern stretching across months, possibly years. And for the first time since Gloria's bright, empty smile, Simone felt a flicker of satisfaction at how thoroughly her systems had gathered the truth. She lifted her eyes just as Daniel stopped at her row, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he offered her another glass of water without looking at her face, his voice quiet and rushed as if saying the words burned his tongue. "Would you like anything else?" Ms. Weston and Simone wondered if he knew the only reason he was speaking to her at all was because he felt the chill of a storm he didn't yet understand, because the woman he'd tried to pretend wasn't there had already sent a message that would ripple through the airline's boardroom before the wheels touched down in Geneva. Simone accepted the glass without a word, the water sloshing gently against the sides as she lifted it to her lips. The taste flat and metallic, tinged with the same dull bitterness as every time she'd been told no one had seen her email. Every time someone claimed her seat had been given away, every time a reservation or an invitation mysteriously disappeared without explanation, and she thought how easily they convinced themselves these were isolated oversights, instead of a pattern of soft exclusion that wore you down so slowly you began to question whether you were imagining it. And as the thought passed, she reminded herself the true danger wasn't in their ignorance, but in the possibility that they knew exactly what they were doing. She set the glass back on the tray as a fresh wave of laughter bubbled up from the men behind her, the word privilege catching her ear like a sliver of glass, sharp and glinting. And she wondered if they would still be laughing when they learned the woman in seat 1A wasn't just a passenger, but the architect of a network that could lay bare every careless word, every missed meal, every falsified apology, and expose it all to the people who believed the polished veneer of first class meant fairness and respect. And as the engines hummed and the cabin settled into an uneasy hush, Simone Weston decided there would be no turning back. The overhead lights dimmed further as flight attendants began collecting empty glasses, the hush in the cabin thickening as the dark Atlantic spread endlessly below, and Simone sat perfectly still in her wide leather seat while every part of her mind hummed with purpose, her eyes never leaving the silver tray with its pathetic sandwich congealing on stale bread, the thin paper napkins soaked with condensation from the water glass, and the faint scent of microwave chicken drifting like an insult through the stale, climate-controlled air. Each detail a reminder that even here, where luxury dripped from every polished surface, some people were served warmth, while others were handed quiet contempt. And Simone knew this time she would not allow the insult to settle into the bones of the cabin the way it had always been designed to. She felt the plane's subtle shudder as it climbed over a pocket of turbulence, a deep vibration passing through the seat frame into her spine as she tapped a quiet message to Malia. Begin. Final compile use, secure server, cross-check cabin crew records from the past 24 months. And as the letters flicked across the darkened screen, she recalled every panel where men in tailored suits asked if her achievements were a statistical fluke. every networking event where they complimented her poise but never her ideas, and every conference where she was called the assistant until she stepped on stage to deliver the keynote, each memory layering into the quiet fury behind her measured breathing. Daniel reappeared at the front of the cabin carrying a tray of chocolate truffles, his eyes bright and eager as he offered them to Mr. Langford with a low chuckle that fluttered over the aisle like a feather. But when he reached Simone, he hesitated, his hand gripping the edge of the tray so hard the crystal dishes rattled faintly, and Simone caught the faintest quiver in his lip as he realized she had been watching him from the moment he took the first step down the aisle, because he could feel it now. The shift in air pressure, the sharpness of her silence, the weight of something irreversible beginning to unfold in the darkened cabin. She reached for a truffle, the bitter smell of dark cocoa mingling with the sweet, cloying perfume of Gloria, drifting up the aisle, and as she set the chocolate on the napkin without tasting it, Simone studied the steward's eyes, saw the questions forming. There, the quiet terror of someone who suspected they had just crossed a line they couldn't retreat from, and she wondered if Daniel would lie to protect Gloria, or if he would break under the weight of the truth when asked directly why Simone was the only person served an economy-class meal in the most expensive seat on the plane. The cabin lights flickered as the plane banked slightly east, and Simone felt the shifting gravity tug at her body, while Malia's next update appeared in a tight clinical line. 3 confirmed prior complaints for service irregularities by same cabin crew member. 2 flagged as potential bias incidents. Management records show all closed without action. Simone's eyes narrowed as the data scrolled past every line. Another nail in the coffin of a system that pretended objectivity, but quietly judged who deserved seamless service and who could be offered empty apologies. Each detail confirming what she had known since Gloria first set the cold sandwich before her. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern of selective service, upheld by a culture that thrived on polite, deniable exclusion. Outside the window, the moonlight washed over the clouds like a river of cold silver, the occasional star peeking through gaps in the inky black sky, and Simone felt the softness of the armrest under her palm as her mind shifted to the men behind her. Hearing Mr. Peyton joke about how people these days think everything's racist, while Mr. Sterling's laughter rolled through the quiet cabin like distant thunder. And she wondered if they truly believed their words, or if the performance of indifference was part of their inheritance, passed down through generations, who had never feared being denied the warmth of a meal or the courtesy of being seen. Daniel cleared his throat as he stepped back, his voice cracking as he asked if Simone needed anything else, the words falling into the cabin like pebbles into a deep well, and she let the silence stretch between them until the steward shifted uncomfortably, his shoes scuffing the plush carpet as he glanced toward the galley for help. And Simone wondered if in that moment he realized how the quiet composure of the woman in seat 1A had turned the entire flight into an interrogation. None of them could escape a reckoning written in the trembling hush of first class. She finally shook her head once the small motion carrying all the finality of a judge's gavel, and as Daniel retreated down the aisle, she felt the sharp antiseptic chill of the recycled air fill her lungs, each breath anchoring her resolve as she opened the secure communication log and began composing the message that would strip away the thin layer of sophistication protecting stratosphere, air from accountability, her words measured and direct. Request immediate escalation, initiate ethics. Review, confirm, preservation of cabin footage, prioritize timeline for board-level review upon arrival in Geneva. The cabin lights shifted again, a faint golden glow replacing the pale blue as the plane descended slightly in preparation for the long overnight stretch to Europe, and Simone thought about her mother's words, spoken in the kitchen of a small apartment decades ago. The world will ask you to be silent, so it can pretend it's fair. Never give it that gift, and as the memory bloomed, she felt the tightness in her chest soften into something deeper than anger, something that felt like purpose, and wondered if Gloria, standing in the galley, folding napkins with brisk, sharp motions, understood that a single cold sandwich could break a silence older than any of them. The engines hummed low and steady as the plane leveled off again, the faint vibration in the floor merging with the distant beat of Simone's heart as Malia's final confirmation appeared. Data package compiled, secure transmission, initiated board-level recipients, identified confirmation expected before landing, and Simone set her phone face down on the tray, the soft click of plastic on metal sounding like the closing of a door, because she knew from this moment forward, nothing in Stratosphere's luxury cabins would ever feel safe again for those who believed their smiles and shrugs could remain unchallenged. She looked once more at the reflection of her own face in the dark window, the curve of her jaw lit by the faint glow of the cabin lights, and as she studied her eyes, she wondered how many others had sat in seat 1A or 2A or any other plush leather throne in the sky, only to leave with wounds invisible to the rest of the cabin. And in that quiet question, she found her answer: never again, not if she could help it. The cabin's soft lighting shifted to a dusky lavender as the plane edged deeper into night over the Atlantic, the atmosphere thickening with a hush so profound it seemed even the engines dulled their roar to a steady conspiratorial hum, and Simone traced the cool curve of her champagne glass with a fingertip as Daniel returned his eyes darting from her to the seats behind, his hands fumbling with the silver tongs as he offered another round of truffles to the white men who laughed without hesitation, their voices swelling like a wave of self-assurance that rolled over seat 1A without ever touching it. And in the lull between each of Daniel's strained greetings, Simone found a deep, thrumming quiet that felt almost sacred, the kind of silence only the truth could fill. She inhaled slowly, the scent of stale coffee and citrus-scented disinfectant, sharp in the recycled air, as she listened to the easy banner behind her, Sterling, talking about his new summer estate in Provence Peyton, bragging about his crypto portfolio's gains, and wondered how easily people who had never tasted exclusion convinced themselves their comfort was a natural law of the universe, and whether Gloria or Daniel would ever admit that every small oversight and delayed service wasn't an accident, but a calculated gamble that those deemed outsiders wouldn't dare question the subtle hierarchy of privilege sewn into every seam of the luxury cabin. Her phone vibrated once, a small, bright pulse of certainty against her palm as Malia's final confirmation arrived, package received by CEO's direct line, preservation of cabin recordings, secured emergency ethics panel, scheduled for 8:00 a.m. Geneva time, and as Simone scanned the message, the faint crackle of triumph in her chest surprised her, not because she was unaccustomed to victory, but because this felt different. Not a contract won or a competitor outmaneuvered, but the sound of a brittle system beginning to fracture under the weight of its own unacknowledged rot. The plane jolted as it caught another slipstream, the soft clink of cutlery in the galley punctuating the silence as Gloria's voice floated up the aisle, sweet and apologetic, as she asked Mr. Langford if he'd like a third glass of champagne, her tone a silky balm that wrapped him in belonging. And Simone studied the attendant's every move, the precise placement of glasses, the light touch of a napkin offered at just the right moment, the carefully tuned notes of warmth in her voice, each action demonstrating an artistry of selective kindness that was only ever a gift for those Gloria chose to see. Simone shifted in her seat, the leather creaking softly beneath her, as she glanced at the cold sandwich still congealing on the tray, its limp lettuce now a dark wilted green, pressed flat by condensation. And she remembered her grandmother's stories of bus rides in the South, where black passengers were told they could sit anywhere, as long as they didn't mind someone else's leftovers, and the quiet dignity it took to hold your head high, even as the world tried to teach you that your hunger, whether for food, respect, or opportunity, was always secondary to someone else's comfort. She felt the low throb of the engines through the soles of her feet as Gloria appeared beside her seat. Once more, the stewardess's smile brittle at the edges as she murmured, "Can I get you anything else, Miss Weston?" But her eyes flickered away before Simone could answer, darting to the men behind as if to confirm they still approved of her performance. And Simone wondered how many times Gloria's eyes had sought reassurance from those who looked like her own reflection, instead of offering it to those who looked like Simone. How often she had perfected the art of ignoring those who needed kindness the most. Simone paused, letting the silence between them stretch so thin it hummed like a plucked string, and when she finally spoke, her voice was as soft and sharp as a scalpel. "No, thank you, Gloria. I'm quite full on the service I've received," and the words landed with a weight that seemed to bend the air around them, the meaning clear enough that Gloria's composure cracked for a heartbeat, her eyes widening as a flush rose along her cheekbones before she dipped her head and fled back up the aisle, the sharp scent of her hairspray lingering in Simone's senses like a toxic bloom. A soft chime overhead signaled the final meal service, and Daniel's voice crackled over the intercom, brittle with strain, as he described the evening's dessert options, his tone breaking on the word inclusive, as if he'd realized too late how false it sounded. And Simone let the cabin's quiet unravel around her as she studied the flickering reflections of reading lights dancing across the polished wood of her fold-out table, each flicker a stuttering heartbeat of the old world trying to hold on even as it began to fade. She glanced down at her phone one last time before tucking it into her jacket, the secure chat window still open to Malia's steady stream of updates, the final line glowing softly. Geneva team standing by at arrival gate. HR and legal present, command code green, initiated. And in the hush of that final message, Simone realized the decision had already been made. Hours before Gloria handed her the cold sandwich, she had never intended to let this flight end quietly, because the silence of the woman in seat 1A was a silence that had grown sharp enough to cut. The engines droned as the plane angled toward Europe, the pressure shifting in her ears as she imagined the faces of the executives reading her report the way they would try to calculate whether protecting Gloria was worth the risk of losing someone like Simone. And in that imagined silence, she found an answer that had nothing to do with vengeance and everything to do with survival. It wasn't just about punishing one attendant, it was about forcing a reckoning, so complete the system itself would learn to fear repeating the same small cruelties. As she leaned back into the seat, the soft whine of the air vents brushing cool air over her cheeks, Simone closed her eyes, but her mind remained bright and sharp as a blade already shaping the words she would speak if anyone dared to question why she had escalated something so small, and the words shimmered with quiet certainty. If you call it small, it's because it was never done to you. The cabin lights settled into a warm, golden glow meant to imitate dawn, though outside the windows the sky remained an endless stretch of ink-black night, the faint flicker of stars swallowed by the plane's constant forward momentum as Simone sat unmoving, the gentle vibration of the engines pulsing beneath her feet like a slow heartbeat counting down to Geneva. And with each passing minute, she felt the distance between what Gloria and Daniel thought would happen and what was about to unfold stretch wider until it felt like a canyon in the hushed air of first class. Mr. Langford's low laughter rolled up the aisle as he recounted a story about a junior analyst who just didn't know his place, and Simone noted the easy comfort in his voice, the way he assumed the cabin was his private club, where the walls themselves would protect his every careless word, and she wondered if he realized the very network he relied on to keep him untouchable was already compromised by a woman he'd never even noticed when he boarded a woman who had turned every casual joke and cold shoulder into data points, feeding the collapse of an entire illusion. The scent of burnt espresso drifted from the galley as Gloria's voice, now strained and brittle, cut through the hush with over-polite precision. "Mr. Sterling, may I refresh your coffee?" And Simone caught the slight tremor in her tone, the first crack in a mask carefully worn for years, because Gloria had realized too late the woman in seat 1A was not a silent observer, but a catalyst for everything the airline had been pretending wasn't true about its own carefully curated culture. Daniel paused in the aisle a few rows back, his eyes darting from Simone to Gloria, with the wary expression of someone who sensed a silent earthquake building under his feet, but still believed if he stood perfectly still, it might pass without swallowing him whole. And Simone studied the line of his jaw, clenched tight enough to show a pulse fluttering just below his ear, wondering if he recognized the exact moment he'd crossed the threshold from harmless bystander to willing accomplice, simply by choosing not to act when he'd watched Gloria dismiss Simone's pre-ordered meal with a shrug. A soft vibration against her wrist signaled a new update from Malia, each word stark and certain on her watch display. CEO Direct Line confirmed legal team secured arrival slot, passenger list and cabin assignments, cross-checked, confirmed inconsistency, in priority meal, assignment, process findings, match discrimination pattern. Simone felt the slow exhale leave her lungs as the last barrier fell. The final piece of data so damning it no longer mattered how many polite words or empty apologies stratosphere air could muster once the flight landed. The engine shifted pitch, a low, descending rumble, as the plane began its long arc toward Geneva, the seatbelt light chiming softly overhead as flight attendants hurried down the aisle, gathering stray glasses, their hands moving with mechanical precision, but their eyes flicking nervously toward seat 1A, because by now the chill in the air around Simone had grown unmistakable, a silent warning they could sense, even if they didn't yet understand its source. She traced a fingertip along the edge of her phone, the cool metal grounding her as she remembered every time she'd been told by mentors to pick your battles. Every time she'd been warned that raising your voice would only make you seem difficult. Every time she'd been asked whether she was sure she hadn't imagined the slights. And she thought how convenient it was for those who never carried the burden of proving they deserved to exist in the spaces they had earned, to preach patience and forgiveness from the safety of their unchallenged comfort. A shiver of turbulence rattled the cabin champagne glasses, ringing like soft bells on the tray tables, as the plane dipped and steadied again, and Gloria's voice rose over the intercom, brittle and tight, as she announced final preparations for landing, her words brittle enough to crack as she stumbled over Simone's name, before skipping it entirely, and in that omission, Simone heard the entire unspoken truth, that even at the moment when Gloria needed to appear professional, most she couldn't bring herself to look Simone in the eyes, or speak her name with respect. Outside, the dark sky shifted to a thin band of navy on the horizon, the first sign of European dawn brushing pale light against the curve of the earth far below, and Simone felt the steady thrum of her pulse matching the faint whine of the landing gear, descending the cabin floor. Vibrating softly as if the plane itself understood it was bringing more than passengers to Geneva, it was carrying the first tremors of an overdue reckoning. She glanced sideways at the men behind her, catching Sterling's smirk as he scrolled through his phone, Peyton's bored expression as he swirled the last drops of wine in his glass, and Langford's quiet arrogance as he adjusted his cufflinks, and she wondered if any of them would remember this flight as the moment the rules changed, the moment they realized the unspoken pact that allowed some to glide untouched through luxury and others to swallow endless slights had finally been broken by someone who refused to look away. A gentle chime signaled the cabin crew's final sweep, and as Gloria's shoes clicked down the aisle, Simone watched her every step, noting the stiffness in her spine and the tightness in her mouth, and she knew Gloria had read the shift in the air, understood something enormous and irreversible had taken root in the quiet between them, and Simone wondered if Gloria regretted the cold sandwich now, or if she still believed it was just a small mistake, one she could explain away, with a smile once the plane's wheels touched the ground. The hum of the engines fell into a slow, steady growl as the ground lights of Geneva's airport glimmered like a string of stars, each distant pinpoint growing larger as the plane swept lower, and Simone set her phone face down on the armrest, the soft thud of glass on leather punctuating the hush as she let herself imagine the boardroom meetings that would follow, the uncomfortable silences, the legal debates, the endless risk assessments, all triggered by a woman in seat 1A who had simply decided not to let a cold sandwich in an indifferent shrug go unanswered. The landing gear unfolded with a soft mechanical groan beneath the floor, a vibration that seemed to rise through the cabin walls like a quiet herald of everything waiting on the ground. And Simone exhaled slowly, her eyes fixed on the narrowing strip of runway lights growing larger beyond the oval window, each gleaming bulb reflecting off the glass in fleeting white ghosts as the plane lowered into its final approach, the hush in the cabin deepening, until the only sound was the collective breath of passengers bracing for impact they thought would be routine but which Simone knew would echo far beyond the tarmac. A final chime rang overhead, the soft melodic note almost mocking in its calm, and Gloria's voice came thin and forced over the intercom, each syllable clipped by the tremor in her throat as she thanked the passengers for choosing stratosphere air, her voice catching only once on the word valued, as if she understood. That word now hung hollow in the stale cabin air, stripped of meaning by her own choices and those of the smiling colleagues who had pretended Simone was invisible. The wheels met the runway with a screeching sigh that rattled every loose object in the cabin, the deceleration pressing Simone gently but insistently into her seat as the lights of the Geneva terminal swept past in a blur of amber and white, and she felt the last shreds of the old order fluttering away like leaves torn free by a storm's first gust, every second bringing her closer to a gate where the polite facade would finally crack open wide enough to expose the truth to anyone who dared keep their eyes open. As the plane taxied along the runway, the cabin lights brightened just enough to illuminate every strained smile and nervous glance of the flight attendants, Daniel standing at the front with a stack of neatly folded disembarkation instructions held so tight, his knuckles blanched white, Gloria moving stiffly down the aisle, offering half-hearted words of thanks to each passenger she passed, but pointedly skipping Simone's row, her gaze flicking over the seat 1A like it was empty, her entire body radiating the brittle hope that if she pretended hard enough, the storm might pass her by. The engines fell silent as the aircraft came to a stop, the gentle hiss of pressurization releasing a final breath into the cabin, And in that hush, Simone's smartwatch pulsed once HR legal and security confirmed on site, awaiting at Gate C4 Geneva International. And as she absorbed those words, she allowed herself a single quiet smile, not of triumph, but of quiet certainty, that every dismissive glance and cold shrug would now be given the same forensic scrutiny she had endured her entire life. Outside the window, dawn had broken fully over Geneva, the sky a pale blue streaked with warm peach as the sun rose beyond the Alps, snow-capped peaks catching the light like the crowns of ancient sentinels, witnessing the arrival of a woman who carried in her silence a promise to never again accept the lie that luxury could be neutral, while it quietly decided who belonged and who did not. A soft hiss signaled the front door opening, and a rush of crisp morning air spilled into the cabin, the scent of jet fuel sharp but cleansing as it mixed with the stale, recirculated atmosphere. Simone felt every molecule of it seep into her lungs like a baptism, a reminder that stepping off this plane would not be the end, but the beginning of a chain of consequences already set in motion by the woman who had refused to eat the cold sandwich meant to tell her she did not matter. Passengers rose with the usual impatience of first class, the white men behind her straightening their jackets and adjusting their watches as they prepared to reclaim the world they assumed would always cater to them. Simone watched them quietly, each careless smirk and oblivious chuckle, confirming how confident they were that nothing significant had happened on this flight, how certain they remained that comfort was their birthright, and discomfort a problem only for those not smart enough to remain quiet. Daniel stood by the door, sweat glistening at his hairline, his smile frozen in place as he greeted each man by name, his eyes darting to Simone only once the brief flicker of panic there unmistakable. But Simone simply inclined her head, her silence now sharper than any accusation, a quiet scalpel reminding him the polite performance had failed, and someone had seen it all without flinching. The terminal beyond the jet bridge glowed under soft overhead lights, but Simone's gaze settled instantly on the three figures waiting just past the frosted glass doors, a tall man in a charcoal suit with the pinched, wary look of corporate counsel, a woman with sharp eyes and an HR badge clipped to her coat, and a slender man holding a thick folder whose cover bore Stratosphere's logo embossed in deep blue, each of them scanning the passengers disembarking with tense anticipation, their eyes flicking over every face until they landed on Simone's, recognizing instantly that seat 1A had become the epicenter of something they could no longer contain. As Simone stepped into the jet bridge, the low hum of airport activity rose around her. A distant announcement in French, the clatter of luggage wheels, the muffled beep of carts ferrying bags, and she felt the hard floor beneath her shoes as something solid and final, each step measured and deliberate, as the HR director stepped forward with a pinched smile and a quiet urgent greeting, his voice trembling with the knowledge that his company's future was now tangled with the quiet fury of the woman before him. Behind Simone, Gloria's steps faltered as she emerged into the terminal, her eyes wide as they met the stone-faced executives waiting at the gate, the folder already open in the man's hands as he scanned the flight logs and cabin records. Gloria's polite mask slipped entirely for the first time, her lips parting in silent dread as she realized the polite facade she had relied on for so long was not only gone but had turned on her with a precision she could never have imagined. Simone didn't stop to look back. She stepped past the executives as they closed ranks around Gloria, their voices low but urgent as they began reading from the folder, the soft rustle of papers and the rising strain in Gloria's voice marking the start of an accounting she could neither dodge nor talk her way out of. And in that quiet moment of passage, Simone felt a certainty settle in her bones, a truth as sharp and immovable as the mountains visible beyond the terminal windows. This time silence had not protected the powerful, it had armed the one they tried to ignore. Simone stepped further into the terminal's hush, the polished tile reflecting her silhouette as morning light streamed through high glass windows, warm and golden, yet feeling cold against the weight she carried with every silent stride. The rhythmic click of her heels, like the final notes of a requiem, echoing down the long corridor, as the murmurs of arriving passengers swelled behind her, and the first cries of children broke the fragile dawn quiet with reminders that innocence still existed, even as grown men and women twisted themselves into knots of practiced civility that always cracked under scrutiny. A voice low and careful drifted through the glass partition behind her, Gloria's trembling tone, trying and failing to explain meal prioritizations, flight logs, a supposed system glitch. each word growing thinner as the HR director interrupted with terse questions, his words carrying the clipped authority of someone who already knew the answers and merely needed Gloria's final attempts at self-preservation documented before lowering the inevitable hammer of accountability. The scent of roasted espresso wafted from a cafe on her right, mingling with the sterile tang of disinfectant and the faint perfume of businessmen rushing for connecting flights. Simone felt the smell flood her senses, grounding her in the reality that Geneva, once a neutral ground for cold negotiations, would now remember her arrival not as the prelude to a tech merger, but as the moment an airline's pristine reputation buckled under the strain of truths it could no longer hide beneath chilled white wine and hushed laughter. As she neared the private arrivals lounge reserved for VIP guests, the soft brush of the tailored coat over her arms reminded her of every time she had been told to dress carefully so as not to seem threatening to smile just enough, but not too wide to lower her gaze when a meeting's tension shifted against her, and how those lessons learned through quiet humiliation stretching back to the first time a teacher assumed she needed extra help, because she didn't look like the other children had led her to this exact moment of measured silent power. A porter in a pressed uniform moved to intercept her, his eyes flicking from her face to the discreetly embroidered name on her luggage tag, his expression shifting instantly from polite caution to sudden, startled recognition. He stepped aside so quickly it looked almost like a bow, and Simone caught the brief flicker of shame in his eyes. Had he read the headlines that morning, the first murmurs of executive mistreatment on Flight 3149 starting to ripple out from early morning financial briefings like tremors across the polished marble of Geneva's arrival halls. She nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement without malice, before moving past him into the hush of the lounge where two women waited, slender, professionally dressed, each holding a sleek black tablet and wearing the kind of brittle poise found only in corporate fixers dispatched to salvage the unsalvageable. Simone recognized the taller woman from an old conference on ethical AI, her dark hair now threaded with gray, her eyes as sharp as they had been when she warned a room full of CEOs that bias wasn't a glitch to patch, but a poison that would rot them from the inside if left unchallenged. Ms. Langston, the taller woman, began, voice carefully neutral, but betraying a slight catch on Simone's name. "We are prepared to escort you to your accommodations and assist with any requirements you have." And Simone detected the quiet desperation behind the polished professionalism, the unspoken plea to contain the fallout, to find some gentle path back to a world where the only power she was allowed was the choice to forgive what had been done to her. Simone held her gaze, studying the faint smudge of fatigue under the woman's eyes, the subtle twitch in the corner of her mouth, and wondered if she truly grasped the size of the wound that had been opened on that flight, or if she still believed this was just a public relations mess to mop up before moving on to the next scandal. Never realizing this was not an isolated failure but a systemic fracture exposed by a single woman's refusal to swallow cold humiliation one more time. She accepted the proffered tablet with steady hands, the bright screen already displaying a draft apology letter. From Stratosphere Air's CEO to the esteemed Ms. Simone Langston, words carefully curated to sound sincere, yet thin enough to slip away without consequence. Simone's eyes skimmed each line, noting the evasions dressed as empathy, the generic regrets, the promises to review procedures that rang as hollow as the champagne flutes clinking in first class. Her finger hovered for a heartbeat over the accept button at the bottom of the draft, the screen's light casting a pale glow on her face before she tapped decline with deliberate precision. A soft chime confirmed her refusal, and the taller woman's breath caught audibly as Simone handed the tablet back, the weight of that small motion landing like a silent thunderclap between them. A wave of noise rolled through the terminal as new passengers disembarked from another flight, the swell of voices punctuated by rolling suitcase wheels and the squeak of rubber soles. Simone let the rush pass around her, the chaotic energy of a world always in motion, and felt the calm in her chest deepen, because it was never about an apology crafted to pacify her, but about forcing an entire industry to feel the icy certainty that for once someone was watching who would not flinch or forget. Behind the glass doors, Gloria appeared with a small clutch of crew members flanking. Brickar, her eyes downcast, face pale, as she realized the men in dark suits standing beside the gate were not there to greet her, but to usher her into a meeting she would not walk away from unchanged. Simone caught only a glimpse of Gloria's face as it lifted briefly, eyes wide and unseeing, scanning for the woman she had tried to dismiss and finding her already far beyond reach. Simone stepped into the sunlight, pulling across the tarmac outside the chill of alpine air, brushing her cheeks with a clean, sharp bite, and the fluttering of a flag high atop the terminal snapped with each gust like a quiet drumbeat of victory. The world had shifted, if only a fraction, and the woman who had endured 1,000 small slights now carried the knowledge that silence wielded with precision could cut deeper than any raised voice. The wind gusted across the tarmac, carrying the faint tang of jet fuel and the low, throaty roar of planes preparing for takeoff, a sound that rolled like distant thunder across the open expanse of Geneva Airport as Simone walked steadily toward the black sedan, waiting beyond the roped-off VIP lane, the sun cresting the edge of the eastern sky and throwing long slashes of light across the runway that glinted off her polished shoes with each unhurried step, each measured movement declaring that she was no longer bound by the expectations that once sought to keep her small and silent. The driver stood by the open rear door, his eyes flicking from Simone's face to the laminated pass clipped to his breast pocket, a glimmer of recognition dawning in his expression as he dipped his head in greeting without words, his hand hovering respectfully near the door's edge, as if even the slightest misstep in his posture could reverberate with consequences too heavy for him to bear. She caught the faint tremor in his fingers and wondered how far the rumors had already traveled, how many employees had seen the first wave of internal memos warning them that Flight 3149 had become ground zero for a reckoning they could no longer ignore. Behind her, the terminal windows caught the morning light and reflected it in fractured mosaics of gold and steel, throwing distorted silhouettes of executives clustered in tense knots, their hands moving with frantic energy as they argued in hushed voices, the glass muting every syllable but unable to hide the pale urgency written across every face. Simone didn't pause to watch, but she felt the heat of their panic, the ripple of awareness spreading through layers of corporate hierarchy that the old rules of who could be quietly dismissed had shattered with a single denied meal. As she sank into the back seat of the sedan, the leather creaked softly beneath her, the rich scent rising like a comforting blanket that reminded her of boardrooms she had once tiptoed into, trying to keep her breathing quiet so no one would mistake her for an intruder. She let the door close with a muffled thunk that cut off the chaotic sounds of the airport, the sudden silence inside the car, as clean and bright as the first breath after a storm, and she looked out through the tinted glass at the stream of passengers filing through customs, each step part of the old world that no longer applied to her. The driver eased the car away from the curb, tires humming over painted lines as the sedan slipped smoothly into the early morning traffic feeding Geneva's arteries, the city's skyline beginning to glow beneath the soft dawn as streaks of lavender and peach unfurled above the rooftops. Simone watched the light shift across the ancient stones of the old city, the tall glass towers beyond them catching the sun with cold, unblinking faces, and she wondered how many people inside those buildings still believed they could buy silence with a polite smile or an elegantly worded apology. Her smartwatch vibrated once its small screen blooming with a single line of text. Media alert Flight 3149, incident trending globally official statement from Stratosphere Air, expected within 12 hours. She exhaled slowly, letting the message sink in as a quiet chord of finality hummed through her chest, the certainty that everything she had endured was no longer just her private burden, but a story that now belonged to everyone who had ever been told to keep their head down and not make trouble if they wanted to be allowed into spaces they had rightfully earned. The car glided onto the main highway, the snow-capped peaks of the Alps rising in the distance like ancient judges presiding silently over a world that still believed itself immune to change. Simone's eyes lingered on the jagged, white lines of the mountains, each peak a reminder of how often she had been told the climb was too steep for someone like her. How many times she had been expected to settle for a view half as grand as what others took for granted, and how seat by seat, flight by flight, she had refused to accept less. A faint echo of the cabin came unbidden to her memory, the brittle edge in Gloria's voice, the cold sandwich tray sliding onto the table with a dismissive thud, the easy laughter of the men behind her as they discussed investments in markets she had helped create, yet was still treated as unworthy to sit among. She felt the phantom chill of that moment tighten her chest before letting it slip away. Like morning fog burned off by sunlight, the memory useful only as fuel to keep her steps measured and her resolve absolute. The driver's eyes met hers briefly in the rearview mirror, his gaze respectful, yet shaded with curiosity, And she wondered if he knew the details or only fragments of rumor swirling through the airport staff, if he saw her as the CEO who had forced an entire airline to reckon with itself, or simply another important passenger whose quiet demanded deference. She decided it didn't matter because the truth had already been set free, carried in every whispered conversation, every frantic phone call, every urgent email bouncing between time zones as 1,000 small pieces of the system realized they were now under a microscope. As the car turned off the highway onto a broad avenue lined with sycamore trees, shedding delicate gold leaves, the low hum of the engine softened into near silence. The only sounds the soft rustle of branches in the morning breeze and the occasional distant trill of birds. Simone felt each heartbeat as if it reverberated through the quiet street, each beat a reminder that power, real power, didn't announce itself with bluster or bombast, but moved like a shadow, subtle and unstoppable, until even those who thought themselves untouchable looked over their shoulders and found it already standing behind them. In her pocket, her phone buzzed again, a stream of notifications piling one atop the other. Press inquiries, investor statements, invitations from advocacy groups who saw in her story the catalyst they needed to demand more than hollow diversity statements. And she scrolled through them with a calm, deliberate swipe of her thumb. Each request another confirmation that silence had never been safety, but surrender, and that reclaiming her voice without raising it was the most dangerous thing she could have done to a system that thrived on polite obedience. The sedan rolled through the heart of Geneva as the city came fully awake. Sunlight spilling across bustling cafes where waiters in crisp aprons moved between tables carrying trays of espresso and flaky croissants, their movements a ballet of practiced efficiency, the air alive with the murmur of conversations in French, German, and English, blending into a steady hum that rose and fell like the breath of a city long accustomed to quiet power and discrete transactions that shaped the world without ever raising a voice. Simone watched the morning unfold through the tinted window, every reflection a reminder of the spaces she'd spent her life fighting to enter, only to find herself greeted with polite exclusion instead of welcome. The driver turned onto a side street lined with dignified stone buildings bearing discreet brass plaques announcing banks older than most nations, each entrance guarded by uniformed men who glanced at the passing car with cool professionalism. Simone felt a flicker of old familiar memory, how she had once come here for meetings as a junior executive, stepping from cabs with careful posture, measuring every word so as not to appear angry or emotional, when men across the table questioned if her numbers were her own work or the product of someone else's hand. Her smartwatch vibrated softly, the pulse of haptic feedback running up her wrist like a whisper. First official coverage by global media released lead headline, Stratosphere Air faces racism allegations over VIP, mistreatment, CEO's silent sparks industry reckoning. Simone read the words twice, the cool blue test against the black screen, a quiet affirmation of what she had long suspected. It took only one moment of refusing to bow, one cold sandwich served with silent disdain to reveal how many people had been waiting for someone, anyone to show it was possible to stand still and make an empire blink. The car slowed to a stop in front of an austere limestone building with tall arched windows and a brass canopy over double doors, a bellhop already moving forward with a gloved hand to open the sedan's door. As Simone stepped out, the scent of polished wood and fresh flowers wafted from the lobby, mingling with the faint diesel tang of delivery trucks rumbling past on the avenue, each breath grounding her in the knowledge that the next steps were hers alone, not to prove her worth, but to decide what kind of future she wanted to carve from the chaos now rippling outward. A woman in an immaculately cut navy suit appeared in the lobby, her name badge reading Adele Rue Stratosphere. Guest relations eyes wide but composed as she took in Simone's presence. Adele stepped forward with careful precision, each movement rehearsed yet tinged with nervousness, her voice low but tight as she spoke. Ms. Langston, on behalf of Stratosphere Air, we wish to express our deepest regrets for your experience, and we are prepared to provide any support you require during your stay. Simone caught the subtle shift in Adele's tone, the tension vibrating beneath the polished words, like the high note of a violin string pulled too taut. She nodded once, saying nothing, letting the silence settle between them like a stone dropped into a still pond. Adele's eyes flickered briefly to the dark sedan pulling away, then back to Simone, her lips parting as if to offer more words before closing again, the unspoken realization hanging there. This wasn't a negotiation nor an opportunity to contain the story. It was a reckoning unfolding in real time, and she was merely a witness to its quiet fury. The lobby's marble floor gleamed beneath the soaring ceiling, its veins of white and gray twisting like frozen lightning, and Simone's footsteps echoed softly as she crossed into the hotel's hush, each muted impact a drumbeat of intent. She felt eyes turn subtly from behind newspapers and glowing phone screens, sensed the ripple of awareness as patrons recognized her from the morning's headlines, their stares, not curious but hungry, each glance proof that the tale of Seat 1A had already grown larger than herself, a symbol for every unspoken slight others had swallowed in silence. A bell chimed as the elevator doors opened, the brushed steel interior reflecting Simone's face in fractured lines. She stepped inside alone, the doors closing with a soft hiss that cut off the lobby's murmur. And in the enclosed space, she let the weight of the morning settle into her bones, each breath filling her chest with the knowledge that there was no turning back. No polite apology that could unwind what had been set in motion with the quiet, lethal precision of a single line spoken on a plane. I understand now. As the elevator rose, she watched the floor indicator tick upward, the gentle whir of the motor mixing with the faint scent of lavender piped through the ventilation system. Each passing number felt like a measure of distance, from the old rules she had lived by the rule that said gratitude must be silent, that survival meant ignoring every cold glance and petty indignity, that even in first class she was to remember her place as a guest in someone else's world. The doors slid open on the 14th floor, with a muted chime revealing a corridor bathed in morning light streaming through tall windows that framed the snow-kissed peaks beyond. A pair of housekeeping staff stood quietly near a service cart, eyes lowering instantly as Simone stepped past, their faces unreadable, but their postures shifting with a subtle respect that spoke not of fear, but of recognition of the quiet power radiating from someone who had cracked the illusion that luxury was ever truly neutral. Adele trailed a step behind her tablet clasped like a shield against her chest, her voice a measured murmur as she pointed out the suite prepared for Simone, every word an attempt to balance deference with control, as if naming the amenities, private dining, panoramic balcony, complimentary concierge, could erase the raw truth of the plane's cabin and replace it with curated comfort. Simone let her speak each syllable, sliding past her like raindrops against stone, the real conversation already unfolding far beyond these walls. The door to the suite opened on a quiet hiss of hydraulics, revealing a sunlit expanse of creamy walls and pale oak floors, the air perfumed with the faint trace of bergamot and polished leather, as if the room itself had been curated to soothe nerves frayed by long flights and restless nights. Simone stepped inside with the calm of someone who had seen the center of a storm and chosen to walk through it, her eyes sweeping across the tastefully arranged furniture, the discreet placement of fresh orchids on a lacquered sideboard, the untouched bowl of polished fruit catching the light like a small, silent offering. Adele hovered at the threshold, her presence hesitant, the tablet in her hands held against her ribs as if it were both shield and confession. Her voice cracked the hush with a brittle cheerfulness. "Ms. Langston, should you require any assistance or wish to arrange meetings, please don't hesitate to contact me directly. We remain entirely at your disposal." The words fell like glass beads on marble, each one rolling into silence without finding purchase, because between them lay the chasm of a system exposed one Adele could not bridge with pleasantries alone. Simone turned her head, letting the morning light catch her eyes as they met Adele's, the silence stretching long enough for the guest relations officer's breath to quicken just perceptibly. It was in that breath, in that delicate flutter of realization, that Simone saw the understanding beginning to dawn, that the woman before her was not here to be soothed, not here to accept a warm meal and a handwritten apology, but here to ensure that the quiet violence done to her seat and the thousand unacknowledged seats like it would never again be mistaken for an acceptable cost of doing business. Adele swallowed, lips parting, as if to add something more, then closing again with a faint, resigned nod. She stepped backward through the open door, pulling it shut behind her, with a soft, final click that left Simone alone in the suite's serene hush. The thick carpet muted her footsteps as she crossed to the wide window, the snowy Alps, standing in stark relief against the piercing blue of a sky that seemed to stretch forever, an endless horizon, where each gust of wind raked thin white clouds into shapes that reminded her of shifting battle lines drawn across silent fields. She sat on the edge of a low modernist sofa, her hands resting lightly on her knees. Her phone lying face up on the coffee table, notifications continuing to flash like tiny beacons. Each vibration a ripple of consequence now far beyond her control. Each headline more stark than the last. CEOs stand in seat 1A shakes luxury industry. Airlines rethink VIP service protocols. After viral incident, corporate boards urged to address systemic bias exposed at 35,000 feet. Her phone screen went black, its reflection catching her face in a brief, ghostly double image. She remembered sitting in her first executive meeting at 29, the feel of the heavy oak table beneath her forearms, the way older colleagues' eyes darted over her like she was a puzzle. They hadn't agreed to solve how each question about her projections came with a slant that wasn't asked of others, a quiet implication that her presence was temporary, conditional, a test she could fail at any moment. A new vibration shivered across the tabletop. A secure message from Ariel, her chief counsel, confirming that Stratosphere Air's leadership had requested an emergency call within the hour, offering full cooperation and unconditional willingness to discuss a public resolution. Simone exhaled slowly, the air cool in her chest as she scanned the line again, the words brittle with urgency, words that only arrived once silence had proved more devastating than anger. A shadow moved across the balcony as a bank of clouds slid over the sun, the light shifting to a softer steel-gray glow that turned the distant mountains pale and featureless. She rose, pushing the glass door open, the cold air flooding in with a sharp, clean bite that carried the scent of distant snow and the faint metallic tang of the city waking below. Leaning on the rail, she felt the wind push strands of hair across her cheek, each gust a reminder that change could begin in silence but would always demand the steadiness to weather the storms it summoned. Far below, the street glistened with patches of melting frost as people moved like dark ants between cars and trams, unaware of the small storm that had touched down among them. Yet above them, satellites carried the signal of her words and cables buried deep beneath. Oceans pulsed with the data of her refusal. The world watching not for fireworks or speeches, but for what would come next from the woman who had quietly forced the powerful to pause. Her phone vibrated once more, this time with a message from an unfamiliar number carrying a simple line: "Thank you. You gave me the courage to ask why my name is always forgotten." Simone read it twice, her breath catching, as she realized it wasn't about Seat 1A alone, or even her own bruised dignity, but about everyone who had been told they didn't belong unless they stayed quiet. She felt a quiet, fierce resolve bloom in her chest like a lantern against the gathering dusk. The hush of the suite settled back over Simone as she stepped inside from the balcony, the glass doors sealing with a soft sigh that left the world outside a muted blur, the distant siren of an ambulance and the trill of birdsong folding into a quiet tapestry of sound that barely touched her as she sat once more on the sofa, phone in hand, its dark screen reflecting her steady gaze. The weight of that message, "Thank you. You gave me the courage," hung in the air like a fragile thread, connecting her to countless unseen others who carried the same scars she had spent a lifetime refusing to let fester. The secure line rang a discreet vibration pulsing across the coffee table, its tone low and insistent. Simone answered with a swipe of her thumb, the line opening with a brief hiss, before Ariel's voice arrived, soft but crackling, with an urgency she rarely allowed to surface. Simone, she began using the name they reserved for moments when the stakes were stripped of politeness. Stratosphere's legal and executive teams are assembled. They're not looking for negotiation. They're asking what you want. The words fell like pebbles into a still pool, each syllable rippling outward with the unspoken power of someone who had forced the world to remember it owed her an answer. Simone sat back, feeling the fine texture of the sofa's upholstery beneath her palms, her heartbeat measured, deliberate, as if her entire life had led to this singular quiet moment, when she could finally set the terms instead of accepting them. A small knock came at the door, the sound almost tentative. She rose and pulled it open to find a staff member in a black vest and white gloves, holding a silver tray with a carafe of steaming coffee and two delicate porcelain cups, the bitter earthy aroma rising like a grounding fog to cut through the sterile air of the suite. "Ms. Langston, compliments of the hotel," he murmured, eyes darting nervously to hers before quickly away the flush on his cheeks, betraying the awareness that she was no ordinary guest. She nodded, accepting the tray and setting it on the table with a soft clink of china, the warmth of the carafe seeping into her fingers. She poured a cup, the dark liquid swirling with ribbons of steam, and raised it to her lips, the first sip carrying a sharp, comforting bitterness that steadied her as she looked out over the balcony's view of the city, its rooftops aglow with slanted morning light that caught on cathedral spires and the glassy peaks of modern towers like glints of silent witness to everything unfolding. Ariel's voice continued measured but tense. They know it's not about money. They're prepared to make statements, to restructure policies, even to offer you a formal role advising their diversity efforts. But they're terrified you'll reject it publicly, and they should be. The shareholders are already in a panic. European markets are watching. This is bigger than a single airline. Simone breathed in the scent of coffee, letting it coil through her lungs before exhaling slowly. She felt the truth of Ariel's words settle into her bones, the sense that what had begun with one indifferent shrug in first class had opened a crack wide enough for the light to pour through, revealing every quiet prejudice, every unspoken assumption that had kept people like her on the fringes, even as they built the foundations others took for granted. A subtle vibration against her wrist drew her eyes to the smartwatch. A flood of fresh alerts rolled across the small screen, quotes from social media, snippets of articles, television news crawls flashing, with variations of the same headline: Stratosphere CEO summoned to explain racial bias scandal, luxury service standards under fire, industry leaders silent as Seat 1A saga spreads. She watched them scroll, each line proof that the silence she had refused to accept had become the loudest noise in the world. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the glass door to the balcony, a double image overlaid on the city's distant mountains, and in that ghostly outline, she saw the young woman she once was too timid to speak, when her ideas were claimed by others, too afraid to push back, when colleagues dismissed her contributions with a smirk, too aware that a single outburst could mark her as angry, ungrateful, unfit. She met her own eyes, now steady and clear, and wondered if that younger self could have imagined the woman she had become. Ariel's voice dropped, lower words, careful. Do you want me to schedule the call, or do you want them to wait? They know time is against them now. Simone looked down at her hand, the fine hairline scar running across her knuckle, from a childhood accident glinting faintly in the light, a reminder of how wounds heal when treated, but deepen when ignored, how each cut in her life had taught her to see the soft places others hid behind perfect smiles and polite scripts. She raised the phone to her ear, voice low, deliberate. Schedule the call, but not on their timeline. Tell them I'll speak when I'm ready, and they'll wait. The line went silent for a moment. Ariel's quiet exhale, almost a laugh of incredulous pride, before she answered simply, understood. The phone call ended with a quiet click that seemed to echo through the suite's hush, the silence thick as Simone set the device down on the glass table, her fingers lingering on the smooth surface as if testing the solidity of a moment that felt both dreamlike and sharper than anything she had ever held. Beyond the window, the morning light had softened into a pale gold that turned every rooftop and balcony into a gleaming mirror, the distant peaks of the Alps, haloed by a thin wisp of cloud drifting like a veil over stone giants that had seen centuries of storms and still stood unmoved. She poured another cup of coffee, the porcelain light against her palm, the swirl of steam rising in the cool air like a silent herald of what was already shifting beyond the confines of this hotel suite. The bitter scent grounded her each sip, reminding her of the nights spent hunched over spreadsheets and contracts, the mornings rehearsing answers to questions no one else on the team would ever have to field, the afternoons biting her tongue as colleagues praised her poise even as they cut her contributions from final presentations. A soft chime announced a new message, the screen of her smartwatch glowing with an update from Ariel: request for emergency board meeting confirmed. Stratosphere executives waiting in Geneva HQ. Media gathering outside building perimeter. Simone's eyes tracked the line of text without surprise, her pulse steady as she imagined the polished conference table she knew so well. Knew because she'd sat at too many. Like it knew the hush before someone suggested diversity training as an easy fix. Knew the sideways glances exchanged when the conversation turned to optics and brand protection. She moved to the window, pressing a fingertip lightly to the cold glass, tracing the sharp outlines of spires and cranes rising between old stone and new steel. Below, the streets pulsed with morning traffic, taxis weaving between trams, pedestrians in tailored coats, striding with the brisk purpose of a city that believed it could control every outcome with enough precision, unaware that a single denied meal had already cracked that illusion beyond repair. Her phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. She let it ring, watching the name remain blank on the screen until it went silent, then immediately flicker with a voicemail alert. Her thumb hovered over it before she deleted it without listening, the action almost ceremonial in its finality. No more explanations, no more attempts to spin the narrative into a neat, palatable lesson about unconscious bias stripped of consequence. The suite felt too small, suddenly the walls pressing in with the weight of decisions already made. She stepped into the corridor, the thick carpet muffling her steps as she moved with the quiet certainty of someone who knew the shape of her own power. The elevator opening with a muted chime that sent a faint breeze swirling through her hair as she entered the steel box, its mirrored panels reflecting her from a dozen angles, each one a reminder of how many ways others had tried to define her. The ride to the lobby was smooth, the soft, electric hum of the elevator motor, like the hush of an intake of breath. When the doors parted, the quiet grandeur of the lobby unfolded before her. Marble floors veined like river deltas, arrangements of white lilies breathing their heady scent into the air. Staff members frozen mid-stride as they recognized her presence, their eyes darting to one another with the quick, bright panic of those who knew the moment for pretending nothing had happened was gone. Outside, flashes of camera bulbs popped, like tiny stars against the daylight, as journalists lined the hotel entrance. Microphones extended over each other in a forest of black foam and silver mesh. The roar of questions crashed over her the moment she emerged. Ms. Langston, did you feel targeted? Do you plan legal action? Is this a pattern in luxury travel? Each voice clawed for her attention, each question layered with urgency and angles. But Simone kept walking, the cold air brushing against her cheeks as she descended the short flight of stone steps, each footfall a quiet thunder of intent. She reached the waiting car, its sleek black body gleaming in the sun, and paused with her hand on the door handle, turning her head just enough for the cameras to capture the set of her jaw, the calm steel in her eyes. In that breathless hush, the reporters fell silent, the air electric with anticipation as she spoke only 3 words, soft, yet clear enough to carry beyond the crush of bodies. Watch the system. The door shut with a muffled thud that swallowed the sudden roar of voices that erupted behind her, the interior of the car cool and shadowed, the driver's eyes flicking up to the rearview mirror with a silent nod of respect before he pulled into the flow of traffic. Simone leaned back against the leather seat, the city unspooling past the window, as her mind turned like a gear freshly engaged, each thought measured, each plan crystalline in its precision. The car threaded through Geneva's narrow streets, tires humming against cobblestones, slick with morning mist, as traffic lights blinked green, amber, red in quiet rhythm. Simone's reflection glided across the tinted window glass, a ghost superimposed on the grand facades of centuries-old banks and government buildings, standing watch over a city where decisions with global ripples were made behind doors as heavy as vaults. Inside the car, the hushed cabin smelled of leather and faintly of the driver's aftershave. Sharp, citrusy, almost medicinal, and each breath she took felt like she was reclaiming space long denied her. Her phone vibrated again, the screen pulsing with a message from Ariel board meeting, beginning stratosphere executives already divided on approach statement drafts circulating no consensus. Simone let her eyes linger on the words, each one a confirmation that what had begun with a single shrug in seat 1A now threatened to redraw the lines of power, shifting conversations from hushed HR corridors to the boardrooms that dictated policy and culture across an entire industry. She remembered the exact moment on the plane when she realized the cold sandwich wasn't a mistake, but a message. How Becky's eyes had slid past her as if she were invisible. The way the flight crew's laughter at the back of the cabin had pierced the hushed luxury like a needle. How the 6 white men around her had gone on discussing markets and mergers without once glancing in her direction. And she thought of the years spent letting moments like that slide, swallowing her fury, because ambition had taught her that silence was the price of entry, that gratitude was safer than confrontation. The car slowed at an intersection. A group of pedestrians crossing in front of them, a mother pulling her daughter along by the hand, an elderly man adjusting the brim of his hat, a trio of businessmen deep in conversation, their suits immaculate. Simone watched them, feeling the tremor of realization run through her. How many others moved through the world carrying unspoken slights? How many had never seen someone like them stand unbowed? How many stories of small humiliations had been dismissed as misunderstandings or overreactions? Her smartwatch lit up again, the soft blue glow highlighting the curve of her wrist, a new message flashing. Global news networks requesting interviews, international advocacy groups offering support, shareholder coalition demanding investigation. The weight of what was unfolding pressed against her chest like a stone, but beneath it was the steady warmth of knowing she would never again have to question her right to demand better, not just for herself, but for every unseen traveler who had been taught to shrink in first class. The car turned onto a wide boulevard lined with glass towers, rising like blades into the winter sky, sunlight slicing off mirrored facades and refracting into sharp beams that cut across the street. Ahead, the headquarters of Stratosphere Air loomed sleek and modern, an edifice of gray steel and blue-tinted windows, shimmering in the morning light. Its broad entrance, already ringed with cameras and reporters pressed against barriers, their voices rising in a chaotic chorus at the sight of her approaching car. The driver pulled to a stop by the curb, opening his door and stepping around to let Simone out. As she emerged, the noise swelled, a wave of shouts and camera flashes that threatened to swallow her, but she moved with a calm, measured pace. Each footstep a silent assertion that she belonged not just on the marble floors inside, but anywhere decisions were made. Security guards parted to let her pass, their earpieces and crisp uniforms, symbols of an old order that suddenly seemed fragile, outdated, unable to contain the tide her quiet refusal had unleashed. Inside the lobby, marble gleamed beneath high skylights, the air cool and heavy with the scent of polished stone. Executives and aides hovered in small knots, their conversations cutting off as Simone passed, eyes wide, expressions caught between fear and awe. She crossed the expanse without a word, the hush of her steps filling the vast chamber more powerfully than any shouted demand, the beat of her heels on the stone floor, a countdown to the meeting they had all hoped would never be necessary. A man in a charcoal suit with thinning hair and a name tag that read Emil Brandt, Chief Legal Officer, stepped forward, face tight with professional worry. He began, "Miss Langston, we appreciate," but she raised a hand, the small gesture, the slicing through his sentence like a blade. The hush that followed was absolute, the watchers leaning in without meaning to, the knowledge settling over them that the old rules of engagement no longer applied. She paused at the elevator banks, waiting as the doors opened, with a soft chime, turning her head just enough to look back over the gathered faces, some pinched with fear, others blank with calculation, and wondered who among them would have spoken up if the cameras weren't outside, if the world hadn't seen what silence looked like, when draped in first-class linen and handed out with cold sandwiches. And in that wondering, she found the sharp edge of purpose. She was here not for apologies, not for carefully worded statements, but to make sure that even after the cameras left, the truth could not be unlearned. The elevator doors whispered shut, sealing Simone into a capsule of polished steel and hushed mechanical hum, the mirrored walls catching her reflection in a dozen angles. Each face hers, yet each one a different echo of the woman who had boarded flight 1721 days before, a woman who had once believed that patience would buy her safety and quiet competence would earn her equality. The car rose with a smooth, weightless glide floor, numbers ticking upward in a soft digital glow as her pulse matched the rhythm, calm but relentless. She stepped out into the executive floor, a hushed hallway lined with pale oak panels and frosted glass doors bearing discreet plaques, Strategy Legal Boardroom. The air smelled faintly of expensive cologne and freshly brewed coffee, but beneath that lay a tension so taut it was almost audible. A collective intake of breath stretched across every corner of this place, a sense that whatever story they had prepared was about to unravel beneath the weight of a truth that couldn't be brushed aside with polished apologies. A junior assistant in a fitted charcoal dress waited at the boardroom entrance, eyes wide as she took in Simone's presence, her greeting caught in her throat before she stammered, "Ms. Langston, the board is ready for you." Simone offered no nod, no smile, simply stepped past her into the room beyond where the future of an entire company and perhaps an industry hung suspended in the quiet between words. The boardroom stretched long and sunlit floor-to-ceiling windows, opening onto a panoramic view of Lake Geneva, shining like a sheet of molten silver. Around the sleek black table sat 11 executives in tailored suits, their faces a patchwork of practiced neutrality, cautious deference, and thinly veiled panic. At the head sat Charles Eberlin, CEO of Stratosphere Air, his salt and pepper hair swept back from a forehead furrowed with the weight of 1,000 unread emails and the knowledge that the world was watching his next move. Simone's heels clicked once, twice across the hardwood before falling silent as she stopped behind the empty chair, left for her at the far end of the table, the air in the room pressing in like the eye of a storm. She took her time placing her phone on the table screen down before lifting her gaze to meet each pair of eyes in turn, letting the hush stretch until it was no longer a courtesy but a demand. Charles cleared his throat, his voice dry. Ms. Langston, let me begin by saying we deeply regret what happened aboard Flight 1721. We understand how she lifted a single eyebrow, the slight arch cutting his sentence short, the gesture landing with more force than any raised voice could have summoned. Silence pulsed across the table, each executive shrinking by degrees as they realized the usual platitudes had already died on their tongues. She spoke softly, yet the words carried like iron across still water. I'm not here for your regrets. I'm here for your admissions. Her eyes flicked to the digital notepad before the chief legal officer. Let's start with the timeline. When did you first receive passenger complaints about discriminatory service patterns on your first-class routes? The question dropped like a stone into the hush ripples of shifting weight and darting eyes betraying the sudden scramble behind calm facades. Emil Brandt fumbled with his tablet, voice catching. There have been sporadic reports over the past 3 years, but we didn't find patterns that met the threshold for formal investigation. Simone's soft laugh cut him off. Not cruel but sharp with disbelief, its sound curling through the air like smoke. The faint herbal scent of the boardroom's ornamental eucalyptus arrangement drifted with it, oddly soothing in its contrast to the sudden charged atmosphere. She leaned forward, palms flat on the cool black table. Your threshold is irrelevant when the patterns are lived realities, she said, each word dropping steady as a hammer. Every shrug, every cold meal, every time my name was replaced with guest, while my white peers were greeted personally. This was not an accident. This was your culture. A faint click of a pen broke the silence, a tremor running through the man who held it. On the lake outside, a sailboat moved across the water in slow majesty, its white canvas snapping in the breeze, a reminder that even the stillest surfaces could hide fierce undercurrents. Simone's gaze didn't waver. I'm here because I will not allow my experience to become another line in a quarterly report filed under reputational risk. I'm here because if you truly want to change, it starts with accountability and ends with systemic overhaul. She watched as the words settled, watched them land on faces that finally began to register the cost of what they had allowed to flourish in the shadows of polite service. Some lowered their eyes, others shifted uncomfortably. One or two dared a glance at Charles, whose jaw worked silently as he absorbed the quiet truth that the woman standing before them now controlled not only the narrative but the fate of their legacy. A long hush spread like a fine mist across the sunlit boardroom as Simone's final words settled into the polished corners of the space, the muted tick of the wall clock slicing the silence into measured seconds. Every person around the table seemed caught between instinctive defensiveness and the dawning realization that each one of those seconds belonged not to them, but to the woman standing at the far end of the table with her hands steady, her presence radiating the quiet certainty of someone who no longer asked for respect, but commanded it. Charles Eberlin shifted in his leather chair, the soft creak loud in the hush, his face pale above the starched collar of his shirt as he tried once more to summon the right words. But what came out was brittle and small. What? What do you want from us, Miss Langston? His voice cracked on the last word, the syllable fracturing like thin ice over deep water. Simone breathed in slowly, the crisp scent of eucalyptus from the centerpiece curling into her lungs as she straightened eyes glinting with a clarity that cut through every layer of corporate strategy and defensive half-measures. I want systemic change, she said, her voice even, but ringing with quiet finality. Not a press release, not a half-day diversity seminar. I want a commitment to build systems that don't need a viral scandal to treat every passenger with dignity. I want a culture where the next Black woman who sits in seat 1A is treated as the default, not the exception. The light slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows, warm and golden, catching the faint sheen of sweat on foreheads around the table. Outside, Lake Geneva sparkled beneath a pale sky, sailboats drifting like white shards across its mirrored surface. Inside, the atmosphere felt suspended on a knife's edge as the words carried their quiet, unstoppable momentum. She continued, voice low, threading each word with steel. I want immediate suspension of all employees with repeated complaints of biased service. I want a third-party audit of your service records for the past 5 years. I want a standing advisory board diverse, empowered, and public, that reports not to your PR team, but to your shareholders. And I want these terms accepted in writing before I leave this building. Gas rustled around the table, a few eyes flicking to Charles in silent question. The men and women who had spent careers honing the art of risk management, realizing that the usual tools, silence, delay, private settlements, had become useless in the presence of a woman who knew her worth and refused to bargain it away. For a moment, Charles looked as if he might refuse his mouth opening to form words that never arrived. His gaze skimming the reports spread across the glossy table like a paper shield against the truth pressing in on all sides. But then his eyes dropped, shoulders slumping with the brittle grace of surrender as he exhaled a shaky breath. We, we accept, he said quietly, voice fraying at the edges. You'll have it all in writing. Simone's eyes softened a fraction, not with forgiveness, but with the relief of knowing the storm she had summoned had finally broken through the dam of polite denial. She picked up her phone from the table, its screen lighting with an alert from Ariel Global Coverage, surging advocacy groups mobilizing messages pouring in with gratitude, solidarity, and stories of their own. A new surge of determination coursed through her veins, stronger than any anger or pain. As she turned to leave, her gaze swept the room one last time, catching faces lined with shock, fear, and a quiet, reluctant respect. The doors whispered shut behind her with a final decisive click that rang louder than any gavel. She stepped into the corridor bathed in golden light, the scent of fresh coffee from a nearby office drifting into the air, the soft hum of the building's machinery like a distant heartbeat beneath the floor. She felt the eyes of staff and executives lingering as she passed, felt the weight of silence, where there had once been dismissive whispers, felt the shift ripple outward from the soles of her feet into every marble tile and glass panel of the building. The knowledge pulsed through her from this day on. Seat 1A would never again be a place where someone like her sat invisible, voiceless, or unacknowledged. The sun drifted lower over Lake Geneva, smearing the water in molten gold. As Simone stepped from the revolving doors of Stratosphere headquarters, the hush of the building's lobby dissolving behind her into the quiet murmur of the city beyond. The breeze rolled cool and sweet off the lake, brushing her face with the scent of stone and water, and distant pines clinging to the mountainsides. Each footstep across the broad stone plaza echoed like a promise, each breath drawn deep and steady as the weight of the day slid from her shoulders. Across the water, lights winked on in windows like silent constellations. Church bells tolled softly from somewhere beyond the ridgeline, their notes lingering in the lavender dusk. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, the messages piling in from strangers and friends, from old colleagues who had quietly admired her resilience, from young women who had watched her refusal to bow and felt a door crack open in their own hearts. She paused at the edge of the plaza, watching a lone swan cut a V across the mirrored lake, the ripples widening with a patient certainty that reminded her of the slow, relentless power of truth. The sky above her darkened into a velvet blue, scattered with the first pale stars, each one a quiet witness, to a story that had begun not with rage, but with a calm, simple question asked in a cabin built for those who thought they would never have to answer. The air stilled around her as she exhaled a slow, quiet breath that carried the taste of change. Somewhere in the night, a light flickered on in a boardroom where executives now debated not how to hide, but how to repair. And Simone Langston, whose silence had once been mistaken for acceptance, walked forward into the darkness with the knowledge that even the softest voice, when spoken at the right moment, could reverberate through the tallest towers, the deepest halls, and the oldest, most unyielding systems of power. Sometimes the deepest injustices hide behind polite words and perfect smiles. They don't shout, but they quietly push people aside. Silence in the face of these moments lets them grow, but one person's quiet refusal to accept disrespect can ripple outward, exposing truths that powerful systems would rather keep hidden. Change doesn't always come from loud protests. It can begin with a calm question asked at the right moment, backed by unwavering resolve. True power lies in knowing your worth, standing your ground, and insisting on accountability, not just for yourself, but for everyone who has been made to feel invisible.